So welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us. We're going to start a little bit early on Jewish time, and start on the hour. And we are just delighted to have my friend Yossi Klein Halevi with us this morning for us, this evening for Yossi. Yossi is in Jerusalem. And this is Yossi's third time speaking to us. The first time Yossi was with us in person, and it was right as a Pittsburgh attack was happening. We were here in this very room. And then Yossi came back to us after the last Gaza war. And now we're in maybe this most challenging period for Israel since the War of Independence. You could say next time Simchas. And so I'd like to give a little bit of a formal introduction. Yossi is a senior fellow at the Shalom Hartman Institute and one of our leading commentators on Israel and on the relationship between Israel and the diaspora. His articles appearing in many American newspapers. And I can say that in the weeks following October 7th, of all the articles that were going around and exchanged both between individuals and organizations, I think Yossi's articles were the most sent around. And Yossi's podcast with Doniel Hartman, for heaven's sake, has been bringing comfort and a window into what is happening in Israel for many people throughout all of these months. And so we're so delighted to have Yossi with us again to discuss what is happening and to talk about specifically how the war has changed Israel. And we will address a little bit, because I think it's on all of our minds, this extraordinary rise in anti-Semitism here in America and in the rest of the diaspora. And it seems to be so pervasive in our newspapers, in our schools, out of control in our universities. But the way we are formatting our talk is there'll be a conversation based on a series of questions. And we are deeply grateful to Henry and Sally Goralnik for sponsoring this program today. So I'd just like to begin with a general question for you, Yossi. That is, what is the mood right now in Israel? And we hear out here about different periods. We know that the whole country was so galvanized when the hostages were being released. But what is the mood right now? And how does the mood reflect actual changes in the country that you see since October 7th?
So, hi, everyone. Adir, it's wonderful to be back with you and wonderful to be back with the Har Zion community. This is a turning point. It feels like a turning point in the course of the war, both at the front and on the home front. At the front, the fighting is definitely slowing down. It's not winding down, but it's less intense than it was. Many of the reservists, maybe most of the reservists, have been demobilized. Much of the standing army, the draftees, have been shifted from Gaza and are being sent to the northern front. And generally, the focus of the army and the decision makers seems to be shifting in that direction. The fighting is definitely heating up on the northern border. And there's a growing realization, Adir, that we can't leave the situation the way it is, because what we learned on October 7th was that we were living a kind of an illusion where we imagined that we could coexist with genocidal regimes on our borders or genocidal entities on our borders. And what we learned on October 7th is that regimes that promised that they're going to commit genocide eventually tried to do that. And so many of the evacuees from the northern border We have tens of thousands of what we call internal refugees since October 7th. Uh, Many of them say that they will refuse to return to their homes when, even after the war, because they won't trust, frankly, they won't trust the state to defend them if they're living with Hezbollah literally next door. And so there's a growing sense that we're not going to be able to sustain this situation indefinitely. And we're going to have to confront Hezbollah, whether that happens in the next few weeks, whether it happens 6 months from now, a year from now. I believe that that we are heading in that direction. And so the mood of the country is feeling a little bit confused because we were so focused until now on destroying the Hamas regime, but we're not sustaining enough manpower to realize that. So has the goal shifted? Are we getting ready to live with something less than victory over Hamas? And at the same time, factor in the hostages. And here there's something that is really important, Adir, because for the first months of the war, most Israelis refused to consider that there might be a conflict between the two stated goals of the war, uh, freeing the hostages and defeating Hamas. But what Hamas is making clear is that if we don't end the war, we probably will not see the hostages again. And so the country is going to have to choose. The government is going to have to choose. What do we prioritize? The lives of the hostages or destroying Hamas? So there's really a sense of confusion, and you feel it. You feel it in the country. The unity that defined Israel remarkably since October 7th is starting to fray around the question of the hostages and other questions that are emerging. So we're starting to lose a little bit of our focus, of our post-October 7th focus.
Some of what I've been hearing from people who are really, really clued into Israel and clued into the mood in the country is I keep hearing people revealing details from the October 7th attack that just reinforces that how much they hate us. I keep hearing that, even maybe it was a week ago or more, it came out that there was a soldier who shared the same name as I did, so I remember it, but he was beheaded and his head was hidden in an ice cream shop in Gaza. And so I keep hearing the sense of people are wondering how widespread the hate is on the other side and sharing the stories of those who aided in the October 7th attack or celebrated it. How much trust is there or even hope for peace at the end of all of this coming from the center in Israel? What does it even mean to be a centrist right now?
Right now, there is zero trust in the Palestinians, -0. I had a friend who was murdered on October 7th. Her name was Vivian Silver. She was one of Israel's leading peace activists. She was a founder of the organization called Women Wage Peace. And she used to help organize the efforts to drive Gazans who needed operations in Israeli hospitals from the border to the hospitals. And she was very active in Bedouin rights. She and I disagreed about a lot of things. She was considerably to the left of me. But I think a lot about Vivian and about many others, peace activists who were murdered on October 7th. The Gaza border kibbutzim were quite left-wing, and there were many peace activists there. And there's this sense in the country today that there's no hope. Now, I understand that feeling of no hope. I don't personally share it, but I certainly understand why Israelis feel that way. But I have to tell you that the if there's ever going to be a two-state solution, and it's a big question mark. It was a question mark before October 7th. It's certainly a bigger question mark today. But if there's any hope for a two-state solution, if there's any hope of galvanizing at least part of the Israeli public to support this, it won't be on the basis of peace. Nobody in Israel, virtually no one, including most people I know on the left, really believe that peace is possible. And for the reasons that you said, the bottomless hatred that is widespread among Palestinians. It's not everyone, and we need to really make that clear. But I imagine it's the majority. And what can nevertheless win back some Israeli support for a two-state solution is not the promise of peace, but of separation of these two peoples. Because, October 7th really taught us there were two takeaways from October 7th, and they're opposite takeaways. The first is that there is no possibility of living in peace with a Palestinian state on the West Bank, which could probably turn into another Gaza. The Palestinian Authority is hopelessly corrupt. It has no Palestinian support. Chances are, if a Palestinian state is duplicated from Gaza to the West Bank, that sooner or later Hamas will take over. And so speak to almost any Israeli today, and they'll tell you, are you out of your mind? Do you think we're going to risk turning the most vulnerable, the most sensitive of Israel's borders, which is the border with the West Bank? It borders Greater Tel Aviv, it borders Jerusalem. Where I'm sitting now and speaking to you is literally maybe 1,500 meters from the West Bank. I'm looking out at the lights of the West Bank right now. I live in the last row of houses in Jerusalem, literally the border of Jerusalem. And 2,000 meters, 1,500 meters away is the West Bank. And so could I imagine taking a risk of duplicating Gaza right outside my window? It's inconceivable. But there was a second takeaway from October 7th, and that is that these two peoples can't live together in one state between the river and the sea. And I think about Ariel Sharon, who forcibly separated Israel from Gaza. He uprooted the settlements in Gaza, which, by the way, he himself built, and moved us back to the international border. And I think October 7th also vindicated him to some extent, because we can't absorb the people of Gaza into the state of Israel. It's inconceivable. So when I speak about separating the two peoples, I go back to the early years of the Oslo process, the 1990s, the early 90s. And we forget, but there were two camps that supported the Oslo process, and they didn't agree with each other. One camp was led by Shimon Peres, and that was the peace camp. They believed that we're making peace with the Palestinians, we're ending 100 years of conflict, and they spoke about a new Middle East, a transformed Middle East. The second camp was headed by Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin, and Rabin didn't speak about peace. He spoke about separation. He said these two peoples can't live together in one state. And so if there's any chance for a two-state solution, I think it's really going to be bringing back the Rabin doctrine rather than the promise of peace, which of course goes counter to the whole Western notion of a peace process. I think we're going to need to change our language. It's not going to be a peace process. Going to be aiming for some form of arrangement. And I think that the lower our expectations and be realistic about what we can hope for, the better chance we'll have about recommitting the center of the political map to a two-state solution.
Will this, do you think, come from the center, or where will it come from? I mean, the left has collapsed. And
There
also
is no,
wanted,
yeah, there is no left. There is no left.
and on the other side, I also wanted to ask and bring to the table, we had images here, in the international press of the conference that was run by the far right maybe about 10 days ago. And all the pictures, they just look so triumphant and jubilant. And the conference was about the possibility of returning to Gaza and undoing what Ariel Sharon did with the disengagement. Why does the far right believe that their moment has come? And does the rest of Israel have the power to stop them from implementing their vision or what they're working towards?
Well, look, what the far right's dream right now is resettling Gaza, rebuilding the settlements. And they have, according to polls, close to 40% support, which is very high, much higher than I thought there would be. But there was still a majority for what I would call a sane position. And the reason that I think that the position of rebuilding the Gaza settlements is the political equivalent of insanity is because it's a fantasy. It's not going to happen. The international community is not going to let us do it. The Americans are not going to let us do it. And for all the bravado of Ben Gvir and Smotrich, we actually learned in this war just how dependent we are on the goodwill of the Americans. And so the notion that we can defy not only our enemies, but our friends, far right, is the expulsion of the Palestinians, both from Gaza and Judea and Samaria, or what we call the West.
Yossi, can I stop you for a second?
Yes.
You came out for the technology stopped working, speaking of depending on American technology, but we, just as you were talking about depending on the Americans, I don't know if you still have that stream of thought, but.
Oh, so what we learned in this war is that we are dependent on the goodwill of the Americans. And for all of the bluster, the bravado of the far right, that we can go it alone and we can defy the world, we learned that that's not true. Sooner or later, we run out of ammunition. And the people that are supplying that ammunition are our friends in America. And the notion that Israel can adopt any policies that it chooses is really living in a fantasy world.
If that brings us to the state of the current government and how Bibi and the government are managing the war, and seeing all the polls are coming out in Israel about who would get support in a theoretical election. How much of the Israeli public would like an election at this moment as opposed to the end of the war? Is there a chance you think that Bibi's government will fall in the next year or so, and how would that happen?
Well, the numbers are rising. I don't have the exact statistics with me, but the numbers of those supporting elections now definitely are growing. I don't think it's a majority yet. I hope that it will become a majority. But many Israelis are very nervous about, and understandably so, about reopening the deep schism that tore this country apart for the year leading up to October 7th. And there really is a horror at fighting our internal battles, even as soldiers are falling at the front. So I understand that horror. I personally am desperate for new elections and would support them if it was possible for that to happen now. Now, what are the prospects for new elections? The numbers show that if elections were held today, the current opposition would win anywhere from 70 to 75 seats out of 120 Knesset seats, which is a landslide. We haven't had that kind of solid coalition since probably the 1970s under the old Labor Party. So we really could be looking at a sea change politically here, of the center-right coming to power and unseating the Likud, the ultra-Orthodox, and the far right, this disastrous coalition that brought us to the worst crisis in our history. And how likely is it that elections will be held soon? I think there are a number of wild cards in this government. One is Ben Gvir, the Kahanist rabble-rouser whom Netanyahu put in charge of the police. And I suppose that Ben Gvir did have some credentials to be in charge of the police because he was arrested dozens of times and convicted of membership or support of a terrorist organization. So Ben Gvir really does know the police very well. But Ben Gvir is actually, I think, a wild card here because he's trying to position himself to be the future leader of the authentic right. Bibi is the leader of the pretend right in Ben Gvir's worldview. Bibi is the politician who always promised strong right-wing policies and rarely delivered. And so Ben Gvir is going to blame any failures of this war on Netanyahu, and he will run in the next election against the Likud from the farther right. And his gamble is that he will emerge as the leading right-wing party. Now, given the tremendous amount of anger and disgust against the Likud, even on the right, I think that Ben Gvir has a reasonable chance of emerging much stronger than he is today, and maybe even overtaking the Likud. Nothing is inconceivable right now on the political map. So I could see Ben Gvir being tempted to bring the government down, especially if there's a deal for the hostages, which will involve major releases of terrorists. Ben Gvir has already said he would bring the government down, and he may. The thing about Ben Gvir that's important to note is that he's not a cynical politician. He's not an opportunist. And Netanyahu doesn't know how to deal with politicians who aren't opportunists, because the entire Likud has been remade in Netanyahu's image. These are cynical opportunists. Ben Gvir is made of different stuff. He's a genuine idealist. And because of that, he really may bring this government down. And do you remember, Adir, the scene in Lord of the Rings where Sam is telling Frodo that he needs to kill Gollum? And Frodo says, I have a feeling that Gollum is still going to play a role in this, yes, right? In this saga. And of course, Gollum is the one who destroys the ring inadvertently. So I think Ben Gvir could be the one to destroy the right-wing government. I'm hoping that he will yet play a role in this saga.
I love that image especially if he's jumping up and down and falling back into the lava. But why would he do it if it would mean him being in the opposition just to have the
Great
strength?
question. Great question. Because look, Ben-Gvir is in his 40s. I think his probably his mid-40s. He's got his whole political career ahead of him. And he's not looking at this next election. Everyone knows the right is going to lose the next election. Ben-Gvir is looking at the election after. And so he is positioning himself to emerge as the head of the right-wing opposition. If he emerges with more seats than the Likud, he will be the head of a fighting opposition, and he will make the next government's life miserable. And I think he wants to position himself as the head of the fighting right-wing opposition. At least that's my hope, because nothing would cheer me more than to see Ben-Gvir fighting from the opposition.
Is there a chance of the Haredi parties realizing that their partnership with Bibi has ended and aligning themselves with Gantz instead and trying to create an alternative government?
Yes, that's the other wild card. The problem is that it's not a problem, actually, from my point of view. It's a strength, which is that Gantz's coalition partners will not form a government with the Haredim. What I could see is a possible split between the two Haredi parties. We have Shas, which represents the ultra-Orthodox Mizrahim, and we have United Torah Judaism, which represents the Ashkenazi ultra-Orthodox. I could see Shas making a deal with Gantz. We will bring this government down if you bring us into your coalition. Now, Shas, interestingly enough, has played a more positive role during this war. The ultra-Orthodox Ashkenazim are separatists and have really just been looking to basically milk the budget, even during war. Now, Shas has too, but there really is a sense that I have not had for many years, and I do have it now, that Shas is looking to rejoin the mainstream. Now, many of its voters, of course, are not Haredi, unlike United Torah Judaism, which is entirely Haredi. So Shas has a non-Haredi constituency. And at least I would imagine at least half of their voters are not Haredi. So Shas knows how outraged Israelis are about this government. And I could see them trying to make a deal with Gantz. The question is whether some of Gantz's partners would allow even Shas alone to enter the government. And, anything is possible in Israeli politics, but that might be one step too far for Avigdor Lieberman, for example.
What is the most surprising change that you've seen in Israel since October 7th?
Well, the most, I'd say two changes, and they were both extraordinary. The first was the way we pivoted instantly, literally overnight, from October 6th to October 8th, from the most divided that we've ever been in Israel's history to one of our most united moments. And if you had asked me over the course of this past year, is Israeli society still capable of coming together, even during an emergency? I'm not sure that I would have answered in the affirmative. But what we learned on October 8th was that we still have the instincts of peoplehood, the instincts of family to come together at a moment of truth. And so I feel the sense of enormous relief and pride in Israel that we were able to do this. The second extraordinary change that happened here really began a year ago, which is when large numbers of Israelis began taking to the streets every single week for a year and taking responsibility for the quality of Israeli society, for the quality and integrity of our institutions, taking advantage of this mass number of people gathering in the streets to put forth a different vision for Israel. And all of this was new. We've never really experienced this level of intensity of so many Israelis taking responsibility for the fate of the country outside of war, outside of the army. And after October 7th, this spirit of voluntarism, of taking responsibility for the country, really came to define Israeli society generally. Something like 50% of Israelis participated after October 7th in some form of voluntary activity. Now, that's extraordinary, 50% of Israeli society. And what we saw was that the protest movement immediately shifted from being oppositional to the government to being part of the war effort. In fact, it was the protest movement that opened up big warehouses to collect clothing and to distribute food, even to evacuate residents from the Gaza border. The government collapsed. The government social services went AWOL. This is, really, don't get me started. This is the worst government in every possible way in Israel's history, leaving politics aside, leaving right, left, center aside, just in terms of this government's ability to be effective. And so the protest movement stepped in. And what this means for Israel is that nobody mobilized us. We didn't need the prime minister to inspire us. Only 15% of Israelis want Netanyahu to remain in power. 60% of Israelis, according to a recent poll, believe that Netanyahu places his personal interests ahead of the country's interests. Now, the reason I'm saying this in answer to your question is because I don't think in the past, I'm thinking now of the 1960s or 70s, I don't think Israelis would have been able to go to war if they didn't believe that their leadership had integrity, cared about the country. This is the first time in our history that we're going to war where a majority of Israelis don't believe that their prime minister is acting out of the national interest. That's extraordinary. Israelis always questioned the wisdom of their leadership. It happened to Levi Eshkol in the weeks before the Six-Day War. It happened to Golda Meir after the Yom Kippur War, Menachem Begin during the First Lebanon War, Ehud Olmert in the 2006 Second Lebanon War. But we always knew that even if we questioned our leaders' wisdom, we always knew they cared about the country. I, as a citizen, don't have the confidence that this government genuinely places this country's interest before its own political interests. And yet, I support the war and I'm part of the war. And what I'm trying to say is that this is the moment when Israeli society matured, when we came of age and we mobilized ourselves. When the call-up happened, 150% of reservists answered, which is to say that a third of those who showed up to their units weren't even called up. And I don't care about my prime minister. It's not his war. It's my war. I heard Bernie Sanders the other day demanding an end to Netanyahu's war. I thought, it's not Netanyahu's war. It's our war. It's the war of the Israeli people. We're fighting this war despite Netanyahu, despite the fact that he imagines that he's leading and he's inspiring. When he comes on air to deliver one of his speeches, I turn it off. I can't bear listening to him. but I don't need him, and Israelis don't need him. We know what we need to do for this country, and we're doing it. And so I feel tremendous inspiration, Adir, and I think that that's what has changed in this country, is that this is a different place now. We are taking responsibility for this country despite our leadership.
It sounds inspiring and hopeful, and can't wait for the war to end so we could actually see it blossom.
Right.
But there's still a war that needs to be waged, and potentially with Iran and Hezbollah. And what will it take for Israelis to feel like the war has run its course, and to feel, and is the IDF capable of delivering it at this moment?
Now, the army has fought very well, and it's made some mistakes. I think that it's proceeded a little too slowly. I understand why, because the terrain, the battleground is so complicated, it's so convoluted that one really needs to proceed carefully. But the army has acted as if we have all the time in the world, and we don't. We know that there's a deadline. The closer we get to American elections, the more incentive Biden will have to press us to wind down the war. I think he's been remarkable until now, but that unlimited support, or virtually unlimited support, that we've received, we all know is, in one way or another, is coming to an end. So it may not be a question of what Israelis can expect, but it may be imposed from without. So that's one facet. Another is the hostages. If there's a serious deal put on the table, and it seems we're approaching that moment, then Israelis are going to have to decide, do we wind down the war and save the hostages, or God forbid, let the hostages die and continue the war? It's going to be an extremely painful decision for the Israeli public to make, because it's pitting one essential Israeli value against another. On the one hand, there's the value of what Judaism calls pidyon shvuyim. And pidyon shvuyim means that you do everything you can to free the prisoners, to free your fellow Jews from captivity. And that is a seminal Jewish value that really defined Jewish solidarity for thousands of years. And if we have a chance to save the hostages and we don't, it will be a mortal blow to the solidarity that defines Israeli society. So that's on the one hand. On the other hand, we have an equally compelling Israeli value, which is self-defense. If we leave a genocidal regime that did that to the Jewish people on our border after this war, it means we're conveying the devastating message to the Middle East that we're no longer capable of fully defending ourselves. And that will have strategic implications, not in the long term, I suspect in the short term. And so we have these two essential values that really we're going to have to choose between. And then there's a third wild card here, Adir. That's the question of fighting in the north. If the war intensifies in the north, then there may well be a decision made here, a strategic decision, that we've already inflicted enough damage on Hamas. And now we need to focus, we need to turn our attention to Hezbollah, where the fighting and the consequences will be far more devastating than anything we've experienced so far in Gaza.
For a long time, this may be the last question before I'd like to spend a little bit of time on anti-Semitism here and internationally. But for a long time, we were hearing there is no way this war can end without Hamas being eradicated. What I'm hearing from you is that position is softened, and there's a lot more people who are willing to
Yes.
imagine that Hamas will survive in some form and maybe even continue to be in control of parts of Gaza.
Yeah, and I'm not sure where I stand on this issue. It depends on the day because it's such a difficult, it's a near impossible decision to make.
So I'd like to spend just a few minutes and pivot a little bit to what we're all experiencing here in America and really throughout the diaspora, which is this unprecedented rise of anti-Israel, but really anti-Semitic sentiment in workplaces and schools and our communities. And do you think that will this fundamentally change our diaspora communities?
Yeah, I think that we have to define what we mean by changing the communities. And here I think we should really focus on the US because America really is different from other diasporas. Maybe Canada, the Canadian Jewry's experience is close to America's, although I would say that America is still really unique in Jewish history. And there's a temptation today, an understandable temptation, for many Jews, especially Israelis, to look at American Jewry and to say, well, your number has come. You've just won the Jewish lottery. You're back in Jewish history. And America is taking its place along with other diasporas, which Jews had believed in the past were safe refuges. There was Spain until 1492. There was Germany, of course. And now it's your turn. And I am not of that opinion. I think that as bad as things are, and as bad as things can get, what we are likely to see in America is not going to be anything like what Jews are experiencing, say, in Europe. I think it's really going to be different. And, some Jews speak about a return of the 1930s. When I think of American Jewry, the framework of the 1930s is America of the 1930s. And America of the 1930s was a very grim place for Jews. The country's leading hero, Charles Lindbergh, was leading an anti-Semitic movement. The country's greatest innovator and the man who transformed the American economy, Henry Ford, was publishing an anti-Semitic newspaper that sold in the millions. You had a Catholic priest, Father Coughlin, who was passionately anti-Semitic, with millions of listeners to his weekly radio station. And you had the Depression. And so Jews were very vulnerable in America of the 30s. I don't think it's going to get to that point. But if it gets, God forbid, if it does get to that point, we need some perspective because American Jewry got out of the 30s and America got out of the 30s. Now, at the same time, I'm not minimizing what this moment means for American Jewry. Let's begin with the universities. The shock for American Jews of what's happening on campus, I think, is partly because the campuses were the place where American Jews were unconditionally accepted. And it really began in the 60s and 70s. I went to Northwestern in the late 1970s. And I went to journalism school there. And Northwestern, of course, had a Jewish quota until probably the late 60s. And my class, my graduating class, was 40% Jewish. And so I already experienced that sense of unconditional embrace. And what's happening today on campuses is that the unconditional acceptance of American Jews is being rescinded in precisely the place where it was first granted. And so that's a very profound psychological trauma. At the same time, American Jews are being squeezed by the far left and the far right. And the far left isn't fringe anymore, and the far right isn't fringe anymore. And so it's a very scary time, not only for American Jews, but for America. And maybe the last point that I'll say in this connection is that the fate of American Jews is so tied up with the fate of America. Jews were present at the founding of America. Jews were well established in America before there was an independent United States. And so there is no America without the Jews. And what that also means is that the crises that America goes through are going to be crises that affect the Jews. And when it's bad for the Jews, it's bad for America, and vice versa. That's not necessarily true in other places, although I think it's probably true for Europe today.
Thank you. So I'd like to open it up for questions. And we'll have a few questions here in person, then we'll have a few questions online. If you'd like to ask a question here, please put up your hand. And please come up. We'll have the microphone here so Yossi can see you. I think. No, the camera is not on.
No, I don't. No. I only see you.
There we go.
Thank you, Yossi. I ask these questions as an American Jew, far, far away from Israel. I was born 2 months before the state of Israel, and I'd appreciate if you would address what I view as two great failures. One, the intelligence failure that allowed October 7th to occur in the first place. And secondly, the ongoing failure of Israeli public relations here in the United States, where the genocide against the Jewish people, particularly in Israel, but really worldwide, that is espoused by Hamas and other groups, is then pushed back on Israel and the Jews being accused of genocide against the Palestinians.
Okay, thank you.
Could you address those?
Thank you for those questions. In terms of the intelligence failure, I have as many questions as you do. Everyone in this country has more questions than answers at this point. What we do know is that there was an idea, a worldview that began with Netanyahu and filtered through the army, that Hamas is not a serious threat. Hamas is not interested in attacking us. It's not interested in going to war. It wants to govern. It wants to keep getting millions of Qatari dollars every month. And that's what interests Hamas leaders. And of course, we know that that was a grand delusion. But we are all waiting for the Commission of Inquiry to give us some harder answers. As far as the ability of Israel to explain itself to the world, look, there's a group of us who live in Israel, who come from English-speaking countries, who have taken this on ourselves to be unofficial spokespeople, in the same way that reservists showed up to their units without getting a call-up notice. People I know, we all just became available to the media and tried to present Israel's case. And the reason we did that is because we know that Israeli-born Israelis don't understand the West by and large. They don't understand the culture of the West. And so Israelis are never going to understand America. This is really a job, I hate to put this on you, but this is a job for the American Jewish community. If you depend on Israel to explain itself, it's going to continue looking the way it does.
So one more question here, and then we have 3 interesting questions online that I'd like to.
And then we'll have to end on the half hour. We'll end in about 10 minutes.
Couple of cautions as much as questions.
Send a little bit forward.
Could we have a question rather than a statement or a short speech? Just one question, because we have less than 10 minutes left.
We have less than 10 minutes left.
I'm concerned that you're setting up a choice between removing Hamas and freeing the hostages. And I'd like you to respond to the people who said immediately before the war got going that it was unrealistic to imagine that Israel was capable of removing Hamas. It's a political trap to say that Israel can do one or the other when it might not have been able to do.
Okay, good.
First, I would also caution you not to celebrate a political crisis. You're saying that it's wonderful that you have a political crisis that no one has faith in the government, and that's not going to.
I will not respond.
Let go of the microphone.
Let go of the microphone.
Don't celebrate a political crisis.
Got this down, please. Okay, let's take another question, please. I'm not answering that question.
Okay. So we have 3 interesting questions from on the internet. One, what gives you hope and what is your hope? You answered that a little bit earlier. We were talking about the inspiration, the unity in Israel. So if you want to develop on that, that would be not a bad way to end. Another, I think, interesting question from Ori Gottlieb, previous one was from Irene, is how do we manage the inevitable struggle between Israel being a democracy versus a theocracy going forward? And the third, from Peter Saltzman, I'm not sure if you would have an answer for this. It's the million shekel question. Is there any way to do both? First get the hostages back and then destroy Hamas?
I'll start with the last question. We may very well have to make that decision, that we get the hostages back and then we deal with Hamas. Now, Hamas is demanding international guarantees that Israel won't attack after we get the hostages back. That, of course, is not going to happen. No Israeli government can agree to such a ridiculous demand. The juxtaposition of hostages and destroying Hamas is something that I think is a cruel choice that we have tried to avoid, but is probably coming our way soon. When this deal, and there is a deal that's taking shape, will be put on the table, that will, in all likelihood, be the terms. In terms of navigating democracy, classical Zionism, and I would put it even more strongly, every Israeli government until this last terrible government of this last year was committed to a definition of Israel as a secular state that respects religious tradition. And so we have a chief rabbinate, we have, which has far too much power as far as I'm concerned, but nevertheless, those were the arrangements that were made. Israel is, in its essence, a modern secular state. It is not a theocracy, but we have a strong input of tradition that's built in to the society and even into government. This government not only declared war against democracy, but also declared war against the classical Zionist definition of a Jewish state, which is that Israel is the state not of Judaism, but of the Jewish people. That's a very big difference. To say that Israel is the state of Judaism, especially one denomination of Judaism, Orthodox Judaism, is to change the ground rules of how Zionism always envisioned itself, which is that Zionism is the ideology of Jewish peoplehood, and the state of Israel would reflect the totality of the Jewish people, regardless of where Jews stood on religious observance. And the classical expression of that commitment is the law of return, which guarantees a place for any Jew in Israel. And how do we define who is a Jew? Not by halachic criteria. We define who is a Jew by anyone with a single Jewish grandparent. That's a very radical definition. It's more radical. It's more radical than the Reform movement's patrilineal definition. Now, technically, the law of return doesn't define who is a Jew. It defines who is eligible to be admitted under the law of return. But for all practical purposes, it's really defining who belongs to the Jewish people. So the only way that we are going to successfully navigate the tension between theocracy and democracy is if democracy prevails. And I believe democracy will prevail. This government has lost its standing. This last year was a disaster, culminating in the greatest disaster in Israel's history. And as a result of that, I believe that we will see a return to a broad consensus in Israeli society, which is that Israel must remain officially, our governmental structure is secular, with a strong voice or input of religion and tradition in the mix.
Thank you. Do you have time for 1 minute? Anything hopeful to end on?
Well, I think the fact that we're seeing a return of Israeli unity, even though that unity is not going to last, it's certainly not going to last after the war. I think there's a hunger in Israel for us to navigate our differences in a way other than we did over the last year. I think we're going to have a lot more listening and less shouting. And I hope that spirit also informs American Jewish discourse. It doesn't always, we don't always see that.
Amen.
And I think that Israel post-war, we're in for a very long and very unsettling period. It's going to take us a long time to recover from October 7th. But God willing, I believe that what we've proven since the massacre is that we have the ability and the determination to create a society different than the one that we lived through over the last year.
Well, thank you so much. We even got to bring Lord of the Rings and an image of Ben Gvir's golem into our conversation today. Grateful as always, and grateful to Henry and Sally Goralnik for sponsoring the program. And we hope to see you soon, hopefully maybe in person next time you're in Chicago.
I look forward to that, Adir. Thank you all for participating. Adir, thank you for having me. Always a pleasure.
Great to have you. Thank you.
Okay.
Thanks, everyone. What's that? Oh, really? All right. Maybe you cross.